Hello. Tonight we begin in a room that smells faintly of waxed wood, ink, and coal smoke, where tall windows hold back the London fog and gaslight glows in soft halos above rows of attentive faces. You are seated among them, coat folded neatly over your arm, boots polished, heart quietly thudding with anticipation. On the walls hang vast maps, their edges curling slightly, their pale interiors marked with the words unexplored, unknown, or simply left blank. These empty spaces feel less like warnings and more like invitations. So, before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this. And if you feel like it, share your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You can almost hear the murmur of ambition in the air. This is the late 19th century, and the world, at least on paper, is still unfinished. The Royal Geographical Society is holding one of its evening lectures. Men in dark suits lean forward as a speaker points to a river sketched in blue, tracing a path into the interior of Africa. Each gesture promises discovery, each sentence hints at glory. The audience imagines waterfalls no European has named, mountains no Western boots have climbed, peoples no London newspaper has yet described. It feels clean, almost orderly. This idea of exploration, a line drawn across a map, a flag planted, a name added to a list. Outside, newspaper boys shout headlines that turn these quiet fantasies into public drama. Into the heart of the dark continent, one sheet declares. Another speaks of lost missionaries, vanished expeditions, heroic returns. The stories are written in bold ink, but they leave out the smells, the fevers, the endless trudging through mud. What they offer instead is a version of the world where courage is rewarded, and suffering is a brief obstacle on the way to fame. You hear names spoken with reverence. David Livingstone, the gentle Scottish missionary explorer, is already a legend, the man who walked across Africa, who spoke against the slave trade, who disappeared into the interior like a biblical figure wandering the desert. When news finally comes that he has been found, the story is simple and perfect. Henry Morton Stanley stepping forward and saying, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume?" The line is printed and reprinted, polished into myth, even though the real meeting was quieter, awkward, and exhausted. But that doesn't matter. What matters is how the story feels when read by lamplight in London. There is Richard Francis Burton, brilliant and abrasive, fluent in dozens of languages, who disguises himself to enter forbidden cities. His journey to Mecca, his search for the source of the Nile, his willingness to endure hardship, all of it feeds the image of the explorer as a kind of intellectual warrior. Then there is John Hanning Speke, his former companion and later rival, who claims to have found that source at Lake Victoria. Their disagreement becomes a public spectacle, argued not just in journals but in lecture halls, as if geography itself were a competitive sport. Samuel Baker appears in the stories too, adventurer and hunter, who pushes southward with his wife Florence, shooting hippos, negotiating with local rulers, founding outposts in the name of empire. And somewhere in the background, still young and eager, is Winston Churchill, riding with cavalry units in colonial wars, writing dispatches that turn skirmishes into epic tales. He hasn't yet become the man history will remember, but he is already practicing the art of turning danger into narrative. The room you sit in tonight, whether literal or imagined, is full of these figures. Their portraits line the walls of clubs with names like the Athenaeum and the Travellers. Leather chairs, heavy curtains, brandy in crystal glasses. Conversations drift between scientific measurements and imperial strategy. One man speaks of trade routes. Another mentions the spread of civilization. A third quietly hopes for a knighthood, a book deal, or at least a line in the Times. And it isn't only men who feel this pull. You hear quieter stories too, often told with a mix of admiration and mild scandal. Mary Kingsley, who travels alone through West Africa, collecting fish specimens and studying local customs, wading through swamps in long skirts and sturdy boots. She writes calmly about crocodiles, about fever, about nights spent in leaking huts. Then there is Isabella Bird, who rides on horseback through the Rocky Mountains, the Middle East, and East Asia, writing letters that become best-selling travel books. She doesn't speak like a conqueror. She speaks like an observer, curious and persistent, and her words open doors for other women who feel the same restless itch. From where you sit, none of this looks like madness. It looks like purpose. The Victorian world is built on progress railways stretching across continents, telegraph wires shrinking time, steamships crossing oceans on predictable schedules. Science is solving old mysteries. Medicine is advancing. The empire is expanding, and with it comes a sense that history itself is leaning forward. Why wouldn't exploration be the next logical step? You imagine yourself stepping onto a ship's deck at dawn. The ropes creak, gulls cry overhead, and the city fades into a grey blur behind you. Ahead lies a life that will make sense of all your education, all your discipline, all your quiet dissatisfaction. You will map rivers, collect plants, record languages, bring knowledge back to a world hungry for it. You will endure some discomfort, yes, but the newspapers will call it bravery. Your family will call it honor. Your country will call it service. The brochures and lectures never quite lie, but they never tell the whole truth either. They talk about healthy uplands and fertile valleys, about friendly tribes and manageable distances. They describe Africa, Asia, and South America as vast theatres waiting for European actors to step onto the stage. The local people are presented as background characters, either noble guides or obstacles to be overcome. The climate is reduced to a footnote. The diseases are mentioned only in passing, as if they were rare inconveniences rather than daily threats. There is a subtle psychology at work here, and it is powerful. When everyone around you believes that exploration is a noble calling, it becomes harder to see it as reckless. When society rewards risk-takers with medals, books, and banquets, caution begins to look like cowardice. Even a reasonable person, even a thoughtful one, can be drawn into this current. You don't have to be foolish to be convinced. You only have to be human. You tell yourself that Livingstone survived, that Burton survived, that Spakey survived, at least long enough to make his claim. You remind yourself that you are strong, educated, prepared. You have the best equipment money can buy. You have quinine to ward off malaria. You have maps, compasses, and instruments that seem precise and reassuring in their brass casings. You have letters of introduction, government backing, and a small army of porters waiting to be hired. And perhaps most importantly, you have a story already forming in your mind. You can see the opening chapter. In the year of our Lord 1800 and something, I set out from the coast. You can imagine the dedication page, the engraved illustrations, the lecture tours upon your return. You can hear polite applause turning into thunderous clapping as you step onto a stage to describe what you have seen. This is not stupidity, it is narrative gravity. Humans are drawn to stories that promise meaning, and Victorian exploration offers one of the most compelling stories of its age. It blends science with romance, empire with adventure, personal ambition with public virtue. It tells you that suffering will be brief and purposeful, that danger will be dramatic and survivable, that your name will outlast your pain. Even the darker stories are softened by distance. When someone dies of fever, the obituary speaks of sacrifice. When an expedition fails, the blame is placed on bad luck, treacherous guides, or unforeseen circumstances. Rarely does anyone say, plainly, that the entire enterprise might be fundamentally misjudged, that the blank spaces on the map are blank for a reason, that the human body is not designed for this kind of sustained punishment. You sit there, listening, nodding, feeling the pull. The maps glow softly in the gaslight, their pale interiors no longer empty, but filled with imagined rivers, imagined cities, imagined triumphs. The room feels warm and safe, and the dangers feel far away, abstract, almost fictional. And so you sign your name. You shake hands. You begin to pack. In your mind, you are already halfway to becoming the person you will one day write about. The applause of London still echoes in your ears as the docks wait quietly for you beyond the fog. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of any lecture hall or newspaper headline, The real world you are about to enter sits in patient, indifferent silence. A silence that follows you all the way to the docks, where fog beads on your coat, and the smell of tar, salt, and horse manure mixes in the cold morning air. Cranes creak, men shout. Crates are stacked like small wooden buildings along the pier, each one stamped with your name, your destination, your hopes. Civilization is being boxed up and labelled for shipment, and it already looks heavier than it should. You watch as the lids are nailed shut, one by one. Inside them are the objects meant to keep you alive, to make you productive, to make you feel at home in places that do not care whether you feel at home or not. There is something almost tender in the way you check the lists, ticking off each item with a pencil. This is how you turn anxiety into order. This is how you convince yourself that preparation is the same thing as safety. Victorian explorers were obsessive record keepers, and their packing lists still survive. Richard Burton's lists run for pages. Firearms, spare barrels, bullets, powder flasks, swords, daggers. David Livingstone packed trade goods for bargaining beads, cloth, brass wire, alongside medical supplies and religious texts. Henry Morton, Stanley's expeditions were logistical nightmares, hauling tons of material into the African interior, including folding boats, printing presses, and crates of champagne. On paper, it all makes sense. In reality, it adds up to something like 60 to 100 kilograms of baggage per European, sometimes more. You run your hand over one crate and feel the solid promise of it. Inside are rifles, carefully oiled and wrapped, because every explorer imagines danger arriving in the form of an animal or a hostile warrior. There are revolvers too, smaller and easier to carry, tucked into velvet-lined cases. Ammunition is packed by the thousands. The weapons feel reassuring, even though statistically, they will do almost nothing to protect you from what is actually going to kill you. Another crate holds medicine. Bottles of quinine clink softly as the ship sways. Quinine is your shield against malaria, and you trust it more than you should. It does reduce fevers. It does save lives. But it is bitter, hard on the stomach, and far from a guarantee. You pack it anyway, along with calomel, laudanum, bandages, surgical tools, and little brown bottles labelled in careful handwriting. There is a quiet faith here in chemistry, in the idea that every problem has a substance that can be swallowed to fix it. Then there is food, so much food. Tins of beef, tins of mutton, tins of soup, hard biscuits that can survive years without rotting, barrels of flour, crates of tea, jars of jam, bottles of brandy and port, because morale matters, and because alcohol feels like civilization in liquid form. The labels look comforting now. Later, many of these tins will be opened to reveal meat that smells wrong, swollen with gas, crawling with maggots. Preserving food in the 19th century is an imperfect art, and tropical heat is a brutal critic. You pack clothing next, and this is where the absurdity becomes almost poetic. Woolen suits, thick socks, heavy boots with iron nails in the soles, pith helmets, starched shirts, formal jackets for meetings with local rulers because appearances matter. Even in the tropics, even when the air will sit on your skin like a wet blanket, you bring the fabrics of London with you. For women like Mary Kingsley and Isabella Bird, there are long skirts, blouses, corsets, petticoats, layers of social expectations stitched into every garment. The corset stays, even when it makes breathing harder in the heat, because not wearing it feels like stepping outside civilization itself. There are tools too, and not the simple kind. Theodolites for measuring angles, sextants for calculating latitude, chronometers for keeping precise time, each one a delicate, expensive mechanism that must be protected from moisture, shock, and rough handling. Barometers, thermometers, compasses, field notebooks, sketching supplies, specimen jars. You are not just traveling, you are collecting data. You are turning unknown lands into numbers and lines on a page. You watch as porters begin loading these crates onto wagons, and a small, uncomfortable thought flickers through your mind. Each box weighs maybe 30 or 40 kilos. Some weigh much more. And eventually, far from this dock, far from any road, Each of these boxes will be lifted onto a human back. The image doesn't quite settle in yet. It will later. For now, everything feels rational. You have read the accounts. You know that expeditions fail when they run out of supplies, so you bring more supplies. You know that people get sick, so you bring medicine. You know that you might have to fight, so you bring guns. It is all perfectly logical, step by step. And yet, there is something deeply mismatched about it. You are packing for a world you understand, not the one you are going to. You are assuming that what keeps you comfortable and functional in Europe will do the same in a jungle, a desert, or a swamp. You are assuming that weight is an inconvenience, not a crippling burden. You are assuming that fragility can be managed. Livingstone carried a medicine chest that weighed more than some of his porters. Stanley once brought a bathtub on an expedition. Burton packed fine clothing and volumes of poetry alongside his weapons. These are not jokes, they are documented facts. They make sense only if you remember that these men were not just explorers. They were also representatives of an entire culture, trying to carry its symbols with them into places that had no use for them. You imagine yourself months from now, standing ankle-deep in mud, watching as a porter slips and drops one of these precious crates into a river. You imagine the sick feeling in your stomach as you realize that your spare chronometer, your last box of quinine, or your only change of dry clothing is now sinking into brown water. You imagine the arguments, the bargaining, the frantic attempts to salvage something from the mess. None of that is in the packing lists. There is a strange emotional comfort in objects. Each item you pack feels like a small promise. This will make it easier. This will make it safer. This will make it more like home. But the cumulative effect is the opposite. The more you bring, the more dependent you become. Every extra tin of food is another reason you can't move quickly. Every extra instrument is another thing that can break. Every extra crate is another porter you must hire, pay, manage, and somehow keep alive. And yet, you keep adding things. A folding chair, because sitting on the ground feels uncivilized. A tent with a proper floor, spare shoes, extra blankets. A typewriter, if you are Stanley. A harmonium, if you are particularly optimistic about music in the wilderness. You tell yourself that you will leave some of it behind later, if you have to. You tell yourself that you are just being thorough. There is one moment, standing there on the dock, when you look at the mountain of your own belongings and feel a flicker of doubt. It passes quickly. Doubt is inconvenient. The ship's whistle blows. The crew urges you to hurry. The future does not wait for your second thoughts. You sign the final forms. You hand over the lists. The crates are hoisted aboard. As the ship pulls away from the pier, you lean on the railing and watch London recede into a grey smudge. Your gear is now officially on its way to becoming a problem. What you are really doing, though you don't quite see it yet, is trying to bring a controlled, rule-bound world into places that operate on entirely different terms. You are packing clocks for a land that does not care about your schedule. You are packing wool for a climate that will soak it through and never let it dry. You are packing canned meat for a journey that will take so long the cans will rot from the inside. It is not arrogance, exactly. It is habit. You have been trained to believe that progress means accumulation, that preparation means more, not less. You have been taught that civilization is a portable thing, something you can fold into trunks and unpack wherever you go. And so you sail with a hold full of brass, fabric, paper, and glass, all of it fragile, all of it heavy, all of it whispering the same promise. You will not be alone out there. You will still be yourself. You will still be Victorian. You will still be safe. The ocean rolls beneath you, indifferent. The crates creak in the darkness below deck, already absorbing the damp air. Somewhere far ahead, a continent waits that will peel away your layers of preparation one by one, starting with the least useful things, and ending, eventually, with the illusion that you were ever in control. For now, though, you stand at the rail, breathing in salt and coal smoke, comforted by the thought that you have done everything a reasonable person could do. The lists are complete. The supplies are ample. The ship is steady. And if you listen carefully, beneath the rhythm of the waves, you can almost hear the soft, distant tick of your chronometer, measuring time toward a future where your carefully packed civilization will begin to come apart at the seams. And it starts sooner than you expect, with the simple act of waking up beneath a sun that feels too close. The air is already thick when you open your eyes. It presses against your skin, warm and wet, as if the night never really cooled. Your shirt clings to your back. Your mouth is dry. Somewhere nearby, insects buzz with a steady, patient confidence. This is the first morning when you realize that your body has crossed an invisible line. Back in London, discomfort meant hunger before dinner or a cold walk in the rain. Here, discomfort is constant. The temperature climbs past 40 degrees Celsius by late morning. Sometimes it reaches 50. Humidity wraps around you like a blanket that cannot be thrown off. Sweat does not cool you anymore. It simply soaks your clothes and evaporates too slowly to matter. You tell yourself that this is temporary, that your body will adapt. Europeans of the 19th century believed deeply in the idea of acclimatization. They thought that with enough time, enough willpower, enough discipline, they could train themselves to function in any climate. It is a comforting theory. It is also mostly wrong. By the third or fourth week, your sleep is shallow and broken. You wake with headaches. Your appetite fades. Your legs feel heavy. You brush it off as fatigue. Everyone is tired. Everyone is adjusting. Then one evening, as the camp settles into uneasy quiet, a chill runs through you. Not a pleasant coolness, but a deep, rattling shiver that makes your teeth chatter, even though the air is still warm. Malaria has arrived. You may not even see the mosquito that delivers it. It is small, quiet, almost delicate. You swat at insects constantly, but one always gets through. A single bite and a parasite begins its slow work inside your blood. A few days later, the fever comes in waves. You burn, then freeze. Your heart pounds. Your thoughts blur. Quinine helps, sometimes. It dulls the fever. It makes the ringing in your ears louder and your stomach twist. It does not guarantee survival. Even with quinine, mortality rates from malaria among European explorers in Africa could reach 30 to 50% in some regions. That is not a dramatic flourish. That is a simple statistical reality. 1 out of 3, 1 out of 2. The numbers do not care how brave you are, how famous you hope to become, or how carefully you packed your medicine chest. If it is not malaria, it might be dysentery. The water looks clear enough when you scoop it from a river, but it carries invisible threats. Bacteria, parasites, things your gut has never learned to handle. Within days, you are doubled over with cramps. Diarrhea drains your strength. You lose weight fast. You try to keep walking because stopping feels like giving up, but each step costs more than the last. There is sleeping sickness too, carried by the tsetse fly. At first, it feels like nothing more than fatigue. Then come headaches, confusion, changes in personality. People become irritable, then apathetic. Eventually, if it progresses far enough, it leads to coma and death. There is no real cure in your time. There is only waiting and hoping that your body somehow wins. You hear men talk about blackwater fever in hushed voices. It is a severe complication of malaria, where the destruction of red blood cells turns urine dark, almost black. It is often fatal. When someone develops it, the camp grows quiet. People avoid looking too closely, as if the sight itself might be contagious. And these are just the famous diseases, the ones that make it into journals and letters home. There are others that are more mundane and just as relentless. Sand fleas burrow into your skin, laying eggs that cause swelling and infection. You dig them out with a needle, wincing, trying not to think about what might happen if the wound festers. Termites chew through your boots at night, leaving the soles soft and crumbly. The next day, you walk with wet feet, blisters forming, each one a potential doorway for infection. Heat exhaustion stalks you quietly. You stop sweating. Your vision narrows. You feel dizzy, detached from your own body. There is no dramatic moment when you collapse. There is just a gradual dimming of your capacity to cope. You drink water constantly, but it never feels like enough. Salt leaves your body faster than you can replace it. Your muscles cramp. Your hands tremble. What is most unsettling is how ordinary all of this becomes. The first time someone falls seriously ill, the camp buzzes with concern. The second time, people look worried. The third time, it is just another problem to be managed. Illness becomes part of the daily routine, like packing tents or cooking meals. You step over someone, shivering under a blanket, on your way to your own miserable breakfast, and feel a flicker of shame at how quickly you are learning to accept this as normal. The romantic stories you heard back home had prepared you for lions and spears. They had not prepared you for this slow, invisible erosion. You had imagined yourself standing tall in dramatic confrontations, not lying on a stretcher, soaked in sweat, whispering incoherently as your companions argue about whether to carry you or leave you behind. Most European explorers who died in Africa, Asia, or South America did not die in battles. They did not die in heroic last stands. They died in tents, in huts, on makeshift beds of grass, their bodies overwhelmed by organisms they could not see and did not understand. They died in the first 3 to 6 months, before they had time to reach the places that would make their journeys famous. You think of Livingstone, who endured malaria dozens of times and survived long enough to become a legend. You forget that he was an exception, not a rule. For every Livingstone there were dozens of lesser-known men whose names appear only in footnotes, if at all. Clerks, assistants, junior officers, scientists, soldiers. They set out with the same optimism, the same equipment, the same faith in progress. They were buried under nameless trees or left behind in shallow graves by companions too sick to dig any deeper. Your own body begins to change in ways that feel unsettlingly intimate. Your skin darkens and peels. Small cuts take longer to heal. Your hair thins. You lose muscle. Your face in the mirror looks sharper, more tired, older than it should. You smell different too. A sour mix of sweat, damp fabric, and whatever disease is currently making itself at home in your blood. At night, the fever dreams come. You hear voices that are not there. You see shapes moving at the edge of your vision. You wake convinced that something is crawling on you, only to find nothing but your own trembling hands. You start to wonder whether your mind is breaking down, or whether this is just another symptom to add to the growing list. There is a cruel irony in how little your physical strength matters. You might have been a robust young man when you left England, tall and broad-shouldered, praised for your endurance. None of that protects you here. The parasites do not care about your muscles. The bacteria do not respect your training. Your carefully built resilience is reduced to a fragile line of defense that fails more often than it holds. And yet, you keep going. Partly because turning back feels like failure. Partly because you are too far in to imagine a different life. Partly because the same optimism that got you onto the ship still whispers that tomorrow might be better. Maybe the fever will break. Maybe the next river will have cleaner water. Maybe your body will finally adjust. This is how reasonable people die in unreasonable numbers. When someone does die, there is rarely a ceremony. The ground is too hard or too wet for a proper grave. The air is too heavy for long speeches. A few words are said. A marker is placed, if there is time. Then the expedition moves on, because it has to. Supplies are running low. The season is changing. Stopping feels more dangerous than continuing. You lie awake one night, listening to insects and distant animal calls, and you realize that the most dangerous thing in this landscape is not anything you can see. It is not the jungle. It is not the desert. It is not the river. It is the tiny, patient organisms inside you and around you, working without drama, without malice, without pause. The heroic version of exploration had promised you struggle followed by triumph. What you are getting instead is struggle followed by more struggle, and then, for many, an unremarkable death that will never be mentioned in a lecture hall or a newspaper headline. Your body, once so reliable, is no longer on your side. It is doing its best with the materials it has, but it is losing ground. Each fever leaves you weaker than the last. Each illness steals something you do not get back. You are beginning to understand, in a slow and uncomfortable way, why so many expeditions end, not with a dramatic discovery, but with a quiet decision to turn around, or a quiet moment when someone simply does not wake up. The sun rises again the next morning, just as hot, just as indifferent. You sit up slowly, joints aching, head throbbing, and prepare to walk once more into a day that will take more from you than it gives. And as you do, a deeper, colder thought settles in beneath the fever haze. If this is only the beginning of what your body has to endure, you may not be strong enough to reach the places you came here to find. And that thought follows you into the next day, into the next camp, into the next mealtime, where hunger and thirst stop being temporary discomforts and become the background noise of your existence. You sit on an upturned crate beside a muddy river, sweat running down your spine, and watch as a tin opener bites into metal with a tired grinding sound. The lid comes off with a faint pop. Inside is meat that is supposed to be beef. It smells sweet in a way that meat never should. You hesitate. Everyone does. Then someone shrugs and says it will be fine once it's boiled. You eat it anyway. This is what meals have become. Small negotiations between your appetite and your fear. The packing lists promised abundance. Crates of food, barrels of flour, sacks of rice. On paper, there is enough to last for months. In reality, much of it is already compromised by heat, moisture, and time. 19th century canning is unreliable, especially in the tropics. Tins swell with gas, seams rust, contents ferment. You learn to recognize the warning signs, but sometimes you ignore them because the alternative is not eating at all. Breakfast might be hard biscuits, so dry they scrape your gums, dunked into tea if there is any left. Lunch might be a thin porridge made from flour and river water. Dinner might be salted meat, boiled until it is soft enough to chew, its flavor long since replaced by the taste of brine. There is very little fresh food. There are almost no vegetables. Fruit appears occasionally, then disappears again as quickly as it came. You start to understand why sailors used to dread long voyages. Scurvy creeps in quietly when your diet is reduced to preserved food. Your gums bleed, old scars reopen, your joints ache. You feel tired in a way that sleep does not fix. You tell yourself it is just the heat, just the malaria, just the constant walking. It takes a while to realize that your body is starving for something it is not getting. There is local food, of course. You pass villages where people grow cassava, yams, bananas, millet. You see fish being dried in the sun, goats being slaughtered, stews simmering in clay pots. But you hesitate. You worry about unfamiliar flavors, unfamiliar preparation methods, unfamiliar bacteria. You have been taught, subtly and not so subtly, that European food is clean and local food is risky. So you stick to your tins and your biscuits, even as they rot in your hands. Some explorers do adapt. They learn to eat what the locals eat. They hire cooks who know how to use local ingredients. They survive better because of it. Others refuse, out of pride, fear, or simple stubbornness. They would rather gnaw on spoiled beef than try a dish they cannot pronounce. It is not a heroic choice. It is a deeply human one, rooted in disgust and habit. Thirst is worse than hunger. Hunger can be ignored for a while. Thirst cannot. You are constantly aware of your water supply, constantly calculating how much you have left, constantly looking at rivers and ponds with a mix of relief and dread. The water looks brown, sometimes green, sometimes deceptively clear. You boil it when you can. You filter it through cloth. You add chemicals if you have them. None of this makes it safe in any reliable way. Cholera moves through contaminated water like a rumor. One day, someone is fine. The next day, they are vomiting, cramping, collapsing. Within hours, they are dead. Schistosomiasis lurks in slow-moving streams, its parasites burrowing through skin, causing long-term damage to organs. You cannot see any of this. All you see is water, shimmering in the heat, promising relief. You drink anyway. Every expedition journal is full of complaints about food and water. Burton writes about rotten provisions. Stanley describes men collapsing from hunger. Livingstone notes days when there is nothing to eat at all. These are not dramatic scenes. They are repetitive, grinding, demoralizing. You wake up hungry, you walk hungry, you go to sleep hungry. You dream about food in absurd detail. Bread, butter, apples, roast beef, things you never thought you would miss so much. Money does not solve this problem. You have funds, you can pay porters, you can buy supplies at the coast. But once you are deep inland, there are no shops, there are no warehouses. There is only what you carry and what you can trade for along the way. If a harvest has failed, there is nothing to buy. If a village is hostile or simply exhausted by previous expeditions, they will not sell you anything at any price. Your supply chain is a line of human beings walking through hostile terrain, carrying sacks that get lighter every day. When something is lost, there is no replacement. When something spoils, there is no backup. When someone drops a crate into a river or abandons it during a panic, that food is gone forever. You start to ration without officially saying so. Portions get smaller, meals get simpler. You tell yourself it is temporary, that you will find better supplies soon. You have been telling yourself that for weeks now. The worst part is how hunger changes your mind. You become irritable. Petty disagreements feel enormous. You snap at people for walking too slowly, for eating too much, for making noise while you are trying to rest. You start to notice who takes a slightly larger portion, who licks their fingers after a meal, who volunteers a little too eagerly to serve food. Trust erodes quietly, one meal at a time. And still you keep walking. Even with porters, even with money, even with planning. Starvation creeps in because the environment does not care about your logistics. Heat destroys food. Distance consumes supplies. Disease robs you of appetite and the ability to absorb what little nutrition you get. Pride keeps you from adapting. Fear keeps you from experimenting. And time, always time, keeps moving forward whether you are ready or not. You sit by the river again one evening, chewing on a piece of salted meat that tastes like nothing and everything at once. Your stomach growls, not loudly, but insistently, like a reminder you cannot silence. You drink water that smells faintly of rot and hope it does not kill you. You think about the banquets you imagined back in London, the tables heavy with food, the celebratory meals after great discoveries. What you have instead is this: a schedule of disappointment, 3 times a day, every day, as predictable as the sunrise. And as you swallow your last mouthful and wipe your hands on your trousers, you realize that if this is what eating looks like now, you cannot imagine how much worse it will become when the supplies run even lower and the next illness takes even more of your strength. And that worsening future arrives on the backs of people you barely notice at first, because they have always been there, stretching out behind you like a living road. You turn and see them now in the slanted afternoon light. A long line of barefoot figures moving through dust and jungle, each carrying a load balanced on head or shoulder, each stepping carefully into the footprints of the person ahead. The expedition looks heroic from the front. From the back, it looks like a slow, human-powered machine, grinding forward one strained muscle at a time. This is the part of the story that the lecture halls in London never quite describe. No expedition of the 19th century moves on its own. It is carried, sometimes by 50 people, sometimes by 200, sometimes by 500 or more. Every crate you packed, every tin of food, every brass instrument, every folded tent, all of it is moving, because someone local is lifting it and walking with it for hours each day. You call them porters, as if that word explains everything. In reality, they are farmers, fishermen, former soldiers, teenagers, trying to earn bride price, men running from debt, men coerced by local chiefs, men promised wages that may or may not ever be fully paid. They come from different villages, speak different languages, follow different customs. What they share is that without them, you do not move at all. Each porter carries 20 to 30 kilos, sometimes more. Some carry far more when supplies run low and loads are redistributed. They walk in heat that drains their strength, in rain that turns paths into rivers of mud, through forests thick with insects and thorns. They sleep on the ground or under makeshift shelters. They eat less than you do. They get sick more often than you do. And when they fall behind, there is rarely any real option for stopping. You notice that men begin to disappear. One day there are 3 fewer in the line. The next day, 5 more are gone. Someone says they deserted. Someone else says they were too sick to continue. Sometimes it is true. Sometimes it is a polite way of saying they died during the night and were left where they fell, because carrying a corpse is a luxury no one can afford. Strikes happen. Of course they do. The porters talk among themselves in languages you don't understand. Their voices low, their faces serious. They stop walking. They sit down. They refuse to move until they are paid more, fed better, or given time to rest. From your perspective, it feels like betrayal. From theirs, it feels like survival. You are asking them to carry impossible loads through a world that is trying to kill all of you, and you are paying them in coins that mean nothing if they do not live long enough to spend them. The response from expedition leaders is often brutal. Whips come out, chains appear, men are tied together to prevent desertion, food is withheld as punishment. Some explorers justify this as discipline. Some call it necessity. In their journals they write about lazy porters, about treacherous behavior, about the need to maintain order. They rarely write about the blisters that have turned into open wounds on those men's feet, or the fevers that have left them barely able to stand. The mortality rates among porters are staggering. In some expeditions, African, Indian, or Asian porters die at 10 to 20 times the rate of the Europeans they are carrying. 10 to 20 times. This is not a rounding error. This is the core of how these journeys function. The risks are outsourced. The suffering is distributed unevenly. The people whose names will never be in books are the ones paying the highest price. You watch one porter collapse beside the trail. He drops his load with a dull thud. He tries to stand. He cannot. He looks up at you, eyes unfocused, lips cracked, chest heaving. You feel a moment of genuine sympathy. Then someone behind you starts shouting that the line is backing up. Someone else reminds you that night is coming, and you need to reach the next water source. A decision is made. The load is taken from him and given to someone else. He is told to rest and catch up later. He never does. You tell yourself that you cannot save everyone. You tell yourself that this is not your fault. You tell yourself that this is just how things are done. All of these things are partly true. None of them make the scene any easier to live with. There are moments of kindness too, and they are small and easily forgotten. You share a piece of biscuit with a man whose hands are shaking. You let someone ride on a wagon for a day instead of walking. You argue with your officers about reducing loads. These gestures matter to the individuals involved. They do not change the overall shape of the suffering. The expedition journals, when they are honest, reveal how dependent you are. Stanley's great journeys would have been physically impossible without thousands of porters cycling in and out over the years. Livingstone survived in the interior for so long because local people fed him, guided him, and carried his supplies. Burton's linguistic brilliance meant nothing without men willing to haul his instruments through deserts and jungles. And yet the language of exploration keeps centering the European hero. I crossed the river. I reached the lake. I discovered the mountain. The pronoun does a lot of quiet work here. It turns hundreds of human efforts into a single name on a map. You start to see the contradictions piling up. You came here believing in progress, in science, in the moral mission of empire. Now you are ordering exhausted men to keep walking, so you can reach a place you plan to leave as soon as you have measured it. You are watching people die, so you can add a line to a chart. You are beginning to understand that the cost of your adventure is not abstract. It has faces. It has names you do not know how to pronounce. Desertion becomes more common as the weeks go on. Men slip away at night. They leave their loads behind. Sometimes they take supplies with them. You feel angry when you discover it in the morning. Then you feel a quieter, more uncomfortable emotion when you realize that if you were in their position, you might do exactly the same thing. Without porters, everything stops. The guns are useless. The instruments are useless. The food is useless because it cannot move itself. You can barely carry your own pack, let alone the dozens of crates that define the expedition. For all the talk of European superiority, the basic truth is simple. You are a weak link in this chain. You are not adapted to this environment. You do not know the routes. You do not know the seasons. You do not know which plants are edible and which ones will kill you. You are dependent in a way that would have felt humiliating back in London. One evening, as you sit by the fire watching the porters eat their meager rations, it hits you with an unexpected clarity. This entire enterprise is a kind of moving city, and they are its infrastructure. They are the roads, the bridges, the engines. Without them, there is no expedition. There is only a small group of sick Europeans standing in the wilderness with a pile of useless objects. You think back to the applause, the lectures, the maps. None of that mentioned this. None of it showed the long line of barefoot figures fading into the distance, carrying not just your supplies, but the physical reality of your ambition. And as the fire dies down and the jungle sounds grow louder, you realize that if this unseen army ever truly refuses to move, if they ever decide in large enough numbers that the cost is too high, your journey will not end in discovery or glory. It will end right here, quietly, with a group of stranded strangers learning too late that they were never the ones in control. And that realization lingers as you unfold your maps again, hands stained with dust and sweat, hoping that lines on paper will somehow bring order back into a world that has stopped making sense. The camp is quiet in the early morning. Mist hangs low over the ground. Your compass needle wobbles slightly as if uncertain, and for a moment you tell yourself it's just the cold. You tell yourself that this, at least, is something you can control. Victorian explorers trusted their instruments. They had to. Compasses, theodolites, sextants, chronometers, these were the tools of certainty, the proof that science could tame distance and direction. You packed them with care, cushioned them in velvet-lined cases, treated them like sacred objects. Back home, they worked beautifully. Out here, they begin to lie to you in small, devastating ways. Your maps are mostly guesses. Vast regions are marked with dotted lines, question marks, or names copied from second-hand reports. Rivers are drawn where someone thought they might be, not where they actually are. Mountain ranges appear and disappear depending on which explorer's account you read. Distances are optimistic. Directions are approximate. You are navigating a world that has been flattened and simplified into something it is not. You set out in what you believe is the right direction, following a river that is supposed to flow east. After 3 days of hard walking, you realize it is bending south instead. You check your compass. It points north, but the needle jitters strangely near iron-rich rocks. You consult your chronometer to calculate longitude, only to discover that it has lost time after being jostled in a porter's fall. A few seconds off doesn't sound like much. On the ground, it translates into being tens of kilometers wrong. Errors of 100 kilometers are common. 200 kilometers happen more often than anyone likes to admit. 300 kilometers is not unheard of. You are not just a little lost. You are so lost that the landscape around you no longer matches anything on your maps. Villages you expect to find are not there. Rivers you plan to cross never appear. Forests stretch on long after they were supposed to end. You keep walking because stopping feels worse than being wrong. Months pass this way. Not in a dramatic sense, not with obvious milestones, but in a slow, grinding blur of repeated mistakes. You march toward a mountain that looks close and realize, days later, that it is not getting any nearer. You follow a river hoping it will lead you to a larger one, only to find it vanishing into a swamp. You cross what you think is a narrow desert plain, only to discover that it extends far beyond the horizon, its edges receding every time you think you have reached them. Explorers write about phantom lakes and vanishing deserts because the world refuses to match their expectations. Lake Chad, for example, shrinks and expands with the seasons. One expedition finds a vast body of water. Another arrives a year later and finds only marshland. Rivers change course after floods. Trails used by traders one year are swallowed by vegetation the next. What looks like a reliable route on a map turns into a maze of dead ends on the ground. You begin to understand that your instruments are not broken, they are just insufficient. A theodolite can measure angles beautifully, but it cannot tell you which valley to choose. A compass can point north, but it cannot tell you that the river ahead will curve back on itself for weeks. A chronometer can keep time, but it cannot account for the way exhaustion makes you misread your own notes. The psychological toll of being lost is heavier than you expected. It is not just confusion, it is a steady erosion of confidence. Every decision feels risky. Every fork in the path becomes a small crisis. You argue with your officers about which direction to take. You question your guides. You second-guess yourself. You start to feel that the land itself is playing tricks on you, offering landmarks that shift and disappear when you draw closer. Some explorers wander like this for months. Burton and Speke misjudge distances around the Great Lakes of East Africa. Stanley's expeditions lose weeks circling the same stretches of forest. Entire parties vanish into blank spaces on the map and are never heard from again. Not because they were attacked, not because they starved immediately, but because they simply walked in the wrong direction for too long. You think back to the lecture halls, to the neat lines drawn across maps, to the confident gestures of men pointing at destinations as if they were obvious. None of them mentioned how fragile navigation really is when you remove roads, signposts, and reliable reference points. None of them mentioned how easy it is for a small error to compound into a fatal one. At night, you spread your maps out by lantern light and try to make sense of your own scribbled notes. You draw question marks. You erase and redraw routes. You argue quietly with yourself about whether you are north or south of where you think you are. The paper is damp. The ink runs. Your careful records begin to look as uncertain as the world they describe. There is a moment, one evening, when you realize that you could die out here without ever knowing exactly where you were. Your body might be found years later by another expedition, or it might not be found at all. Your name might become a footnote about a lost party. The precise location of your end would be a matter of speculation, a blank spot filled in by rumor and guesswork. Even with the best equipment of your age, you are still fundamentally navigating by hope. You start to rely more on local knowledge, on guides who know which valleys flood, which trails are used by traders, which rivers are safe to cross in which seasons. You realize, too late, that your maps should have been built around their understanding rather than the other way around. But trust is fragile. Miscommunication is constant. A single misunderstood gesture can send you days off course. And still you keep walking, because turning back feels like admitting that all of this has been for nothing. The world stretches wider than expected. Horizons keep receding. Certainty dissolves into routine uncertainty. You wake each morning not knowing exactly where you are or how far you have to go. You begin to measure progress, not in kilometers, but in how many people are still alive, how many crates are still intact, how much hope you can still summon. As you set off again, boots sinking into unfamiliar soil, compass trembling in your hand, a quiet, unsettling thought takes root. If you are this lost now, with instruments, guides, and a whole expedition behind you, what would happen if just one more thing went wrong? The land offers no answer. It simply opens out in front of you, indifferent and immense, inviting you to take another step into a future where the map in your hand and the world under your feet no longer agree. And that uneasy thought follows you into the night, when the campfire burns low and the darkness presses in from all sides, alive with sounds you do not recognize. Somewhere beyond the ring of light, something moves. You hear a low cough that might be a lion. You hear a laugh that might be a hyena. You hear voices that are not your own, drifting faintly through the trees. Your hand tightens around your rifle because this is the danger you were prepared for. This is the part of the adventure you thought would define the story. It almost never does. Predators are real out here, but they are not the constant, cinematic threat you imagined. Lions, leopards, hyenas, they watch you more often than they attack you. A large group of humans, noisy and armed, is not an easy target. The animals know this. They circle at a distance. They test the edges. They wait. When attacks happen, they are usually quick and ugly and strangely quiet. A man steps away from the camp to relieve himself and does not come back. Someone falls behind on the trail, too weak to keep up, and the group keeps walking because stopping feels more dangerous than leaving him. The next day, his body is found half hidden in the grass, the work already done. Predators do not hunt your expedition. They finish what disease and exhaustion have started. Leopards are the most unsettling. They are silent, almost invisible, melting out of the trees and back into them without warning. A single scream in the night, a thud, and then nothing. By morning there is only blood and a dragged trail leading into the bush. The camp is shaken for a day or two. Then the routines return. There is no time for prolonged fear. Hyenas come at night and circle the camp, their calls rising and falling like manic laughter. They steal food if it is left unguarded. They gnaw on discarded bones. Sometimes they test a sleeping person's foot or hand just to see what happens. You wake with your heart racing, convinced that you are about to be eaten alive. You almost never are. The truth, which feels faintly disappointing, even as it should be comforting, is that animals are not your main problem. They are background noise in a story dominated by hunger, fever, and confusion. They are a threat, yes, but a manageable one compared to everything else trying to kill you. The same is true of human conflict. You meet local groups along your route, and most of these encounters are tense but not violent. People watch you from a distance. They whisper among themselves. They send out representatives to talk. You trade beads or cloth for food. You exchange gestures of cautious politeness. You move on. The Empire's propaganda back home talks about savage hostility. The reality is usually wary indifference. When violence does break out, it is rarely the result of some deep cultural hatred or dramatic misunderstanding. It is usually about food. Your porters are starving. They slip into fields at night and steal crops. They slaughter a goat that does not belong to them. From their perspective, it is survival. From the villager's perspective, it is theft. Angry words are exchanged. Someone throws a stone. Someone fires a warning shot. Panic spreads faster than reason. Within minutes, a situation that could have been solved with negotiation turns into a chaotic skirmish. Explorers write about these moments in careful, self-serving language. We were attacked, they say. We defended ourselves. They do not always mention that the fight started because their own men were raiding granaries or demanding food without fair payment. They do not mention that hunger makes people reckless and fear makes people violent. Sometimes the misunderstanding is even simpler. A gesture that means one thing to you means something insulting to someone else. A gift you think is generous is seen as an insultingly small payment. A rifle shot fired into the air as a warning is interpreted as the beginning of a massacre. Nobody shares a common language. Nobody trusts anyone. Everyone is exhausted. And so the conflict spirals. You find yourself crouching behind a crate, heart hammering, firing shots that you pray will scare people away rather than hit anyone. You feel a strange, hollow relief when the attackers retreat. You feel a heavier, colder weight when you realize that one of your porters is lying motionless on the ground, blood soaking into the dust. This is not the heroic clash you imagined. There are no clear villains. There is no sense of victory. There is only the bitter understanding that a chain of small, stupid decisions has just cost someone their life. When you later read the published accounts of these expeditions, you notice something odd. There are surprisingly few detailed stories about dramatic battles with lions or epic fights with hostile tribes. There are anecdotes, yes, but they are not the main focus. The diaries linger much more on sickness, on food shortages, on endless walking, on despair. The reason is simple. Most people did not live long enough for the romantic dangers to matter. Fever killed them first. Dysentery killed them first. Starvation killed them first. Exhaustion killed them first. The predators and the conflicts were just punctuation marks in a much longer sentence of suffering. You sit by the fire one evening, listening to distant animal calls and the low murmur of your porters' voices. You feel a flicker of fear, but it is a familiar, manageable fear. What unsettles you more is the quiet realization that the things you were most afraid of back in London are not even in the top 5 of what is actually threatening your life now. The lion out there in the dark is real. The men watching you from the trees are real, but they are not the heart of the danger. The heart of the danger is closer. It is in your bloodstream. It is in your empty stomach. It is in your fraying discipline and your eroding judgment. And as you lie down to sleep, rifle within reach, you begin to understand that if this journey ends badly, it will not be with a dramatic roar or a heroic last stand. It will end quietly, with a whimper of breath, long before any lion ever gets the chance to finish the story. The nights are the worst, not because of animals, not because of enemies, but because of the silence that follows the noise. When the camp finally settles and the insects take over, your mind has nothing left to distract it from itself. The day's labor is done. The arguments are over. The pain is still there. The hunger is still there. The fever is still there. And now there is nothing to do but think. You thought physical suffering would be the hardest part. You were wrong. The mind begins to fray long before the body gives up. At first it is subtle. You feel irritable for no clear reason. You snap at people over trivial things. You lie awake replaying small mistakes and imagining how they might turn into disasters. Your sense of humor vanishes. The world narrows into a tunnel of problems and complaints. Then the fevers start to interfere with your thoughts. Malaria does not just make you weak, it scrambles your perception. You wake drenched in sweat, convinced someone is standing over you. You hear voices that fade when you sit up. You see shapes moving in the darkness that turn out to be nothing. During the worst attacks, men scream in terror at things only they can see, thrashing in their tents, begging invisible figures for mercy. Some never fully come back from those episodes. Loneliness settles in like a second illness. Even surrounded by people, you feel profoundly alone. Nobody at home can imagine what your days are like. Nobody here truly understands what is happening inside your head. Letters take months to arrive, if they arrive at all. News from Europe feels like it comes from another lifetime. The world you used to belong to becomes abstract, like a story you once read and can no longer remember clearly. You start talking to yourself without realizing it. You replay conversations from years ago. You argue with people who are not there. You cling to routines with a strange intensity because they are the only things that feel stable. When something disrupts those routines, you feel an outsized wave of panic and rage. Paranoia creeps in quietly. You begin to suspect that your porters are plotting against you. You read hostile intent into harmless gestures. You become convinced that your second-in-command is trying to undermine you. Every delay feels like sabotage. Every illness feels like poisoning. The stress twists your judgment until you no longer trust your own interpretations of reality. Even the most famous explorers were not immune. Richard Burton, brilliant and widely admired, swung between manic energy and deep, bitter depression. His writings are full of sudden rages, contempt for those around him, and a corrosive sense of grievance against anyone who questioned him. Henry Morton Stanley, later celebrated as a heroic figure, was known for violent outbursts, cruelty toward subordinates, and long periods of emotional numbness. David Livingstone, revered as a saintly missionary explorer, spent years in near-total isolation, writing letters that read like the confessions of a man slowly losing his grip on hope. They endured, they survived, but they were not unscarred. Some men did not survive the mental strain at all. A few shot themselves in moments of despair. Others wandered away from camp during delirium and were never seen again. Some simply stopped trying. They lay down one evening and refused to get up the next morning, not because they were physically incapable, but because the will to continue had finally snapped. This is the part of the story that almost never makes it into the heroic narratives. There is no glory in admitting that you are lonely. There is no romance in confessing that you are afraid of your own thoughts. There is no medal for surviving another night of fever dreams and waking up just sane enough to keep going. And yet this is where most of the real battle takes place. Day after day, your world shrinks to a few kilometers of trail, a few dozen faces, a few basic problems. The future becomes a vague concept. The past feels unreal. Time stretches and warps. Weeks pass without any sense of progress. You begin to wonder whether the map you are chasing even matters anymore. In those moments, the mind starts offering dangerous bargains. It whispers that it would be easier to quit. It suggests that nobody would blame you if you turned back, or if you simply lay down and let the fever take you. It tells you that the suffering is pointless, that the goal is an illusion, that the applause you once dreamed of is not worth another month of this life. Some people listen to that voice. Most try not to. They cling to pride, to duty, to stubbornness, to the thin thread of hope that tomorrow might be slightly better than today. But even when they keep walking, something inside them is breaking down piece by piece. By the time many expeditions reach their destinations, the men who arrive are not the same ones who set out. They are thinner, harder, quieter. Their laughter sounds forced. Their tempers are shorter. Their eyes carry a flat, distant look that does not disappear when they return home. The body can heal from wounds and illness. The mind, once pushed far enough, never fully forgets what it learned out here in the silence. And when those survivors return, they carry that silence back into the world that made them heroes. You can see it preserved in quiet museum halls, in glass cases, and polished plaques that list names and dates, but not the cost. Portraits show clean jackets, confident stares, flags draped just so, as if suffering were a temporary inconvenience rather than the main event. The stories are framed as triumphs, rivers traced, mountains named, borders redrawn. The dead porters are footnotes. The fevers are anecdotes. The madness is politely ignored. You are invited to admire endurance, bravery, and curiosity, and you probably do. Those qualities were real, but the framing is wrong. Most Victorian expeditions were not elegant journeys of discovery. They were slow-moving humanitarian disasters wrapped in scientific language and imperial ambition. They succeeded not because they were well planned, but because human beings can absorb astonishing amounts of misery before they stop functioning. That contrast matters. It shows that the old explorers were not superhuman. They were under-equipped, under-informed, and trapped inside a culture that rewarded risk with fame. Newspapers turned suffering into spectacle. Lecture halls turned trauma into entertainment. Empires turned individual survival stories into justification for control over other people's lands. You are told to remember the great names: Livingstone, Stanley, Burton, Speke, Baker. You are rarely told to remember the hundreds of men who carried their supplies and died anonymously along the way. You are encouraged to admire the map lines. You are not encouraged to think about the mass graves beside those lines. None of this means the explorers were villains. Some were cruel, some were kind. Most were a mixture of both, struggling to survive inside systems much larger than themselves. They believed, sincerely, that what they were doing mattered, and in some narrow scientific sense, it did. But the human cost was staggering, and it is dishonest to pretend otherwise. This is where the story becomes simpler and more honest. You would not have lasted a day out there, not because you are weak, not because you lack courage, but because the environment, the diseases, and the logistics were stacked brutally against any human body and mind. And that is not a personal failure. Most of them did not last long either. Many died within months. Many were broken in ways that never healed. A few became legends. Most became ghosts. Remembering them honestly does not make the past less impressive. It makes it more real. It replaces fantasy with respect. It turns applause into a moment of silence. And in that silence, you can finally hear what the heroic portraits never say out loud. That exploration was not a clean upward march of progress, but a messy, painful collision between human ambition and an indifferent world. That is the truth that lingers in the dust and sunlight, waiting to be seen.